Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another VES-Artex Academy webinar. Today, we are joined by Dr. Nina van Keyserlingk from the University of British Columbia. Today, she will be presenting Dairy Calf Welfare, Housing and Care for the Next Decade. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be answering the questions at the end of the webinar. Dr. van Keyserlingk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annie. Can you hear me, everybody? Hopefully. I'm going to assume that's a yes. Okay. So first of all, thank you to VES-Artex for asking me to talk. It's always a pleasure to share some of our research with the people who I call information multipliers. My understanding is that there's dairy farmers, industry specialists, and maybe even some academics on the line. And I think that's one of it has been a great challenge for us as scientists to how to convey how do we get our research back to the end user? And I think these sort of webinars are huge in helping facilitate that transition of information. Today, I'm going to talk about dairy calf welfare, and I'm sort of going to walk you through a little bit at least from our perspective at the UBC Animal Welfare Program, the last 20 years of our research. And at the end, I'm also going to talk about some of the future challenges that I see in terms of calf care. And I'm just going to foreshadow this a little bit by saying that I'm almost certain that this last bit of the talk is going to make many of you uncomfortable. And, you know, if it makes us uncomfortable, I think it should be a sign that maybe we should talk about these things. And I am also going to tell you, I don't have all the answers. I just know that there's other questions coming. And as a dairy industry, the more we talk about them, the more we will be part of this conversation. And, you know, change always happens. I mean, you know, we look at, as I was watching the video, all the equipment that VES-Artex has developed for the dairy industry has created changes in how we manage cows and calves on farm. Change can also be opportunity. So, but we'll get to that at the end. So, oops. Okay, hold on a sec. So I just want to start, you know, where we started, you know, 25 years ago when I started working in this field, you know, we were, for the most part, most calves were what we call limit fed. So this is a picture of a calf in an individual hutch, or not really a hutch, but an individual wooden pen. You can see that it's probably got, you know, a water bucket, hopefully a water bucket, maybe a starter bucket there. Many calves weren't even given water in that time. There was absolutely no forage. The amount of milk was, you know, maybe 4 quarts, 2 liters, and 2 quarts in the morning, 2 quarts in the afternoon, or 2 liters. For the purpose of this, you know, a quart is about a liter. Anyways, we did these things, and we did these things because this is what our fathers and grandfathers had done, and you know, this was tradition. The problem with that is that, you know, this feeding twice a day, and that was the other thing. I mean, we fed milk through a bucket. People, you know, spent time training the calves how to suck milk out of a bucket, and we provided 4 liters of milk a day. One of the things what we do in the animal welfare program when we're looking at developing solutions for what we perceive to be welfare issues, we look to what nature does. And we know what the cow does. It does something very, very different. She nurses her calf 5 to 10 times a day. This is a picture that I took years ago I grew up on a cattle ranch, a beef ranch, you know, and this was something that for those of you that, you know, have watched these calves suck on those cows, you know, you see all the milk foam dripping down, but these calves suck 5 to 10 times a day. Each nursing bout lasts about 5 to 10 minutes. And we estimate on average that those calves, at least in the beef side, were drinking about 10 liters or 10 quarts of milk a day. So very different than what we traditionally do in the dairy industry. Some of the very early work published in 2001, just looked at what would happen, what kind of feeding behavior or milk drinking behavior does a dairy calf engage in if it's given free access to milk using a teat. So when you do all that, and Mike, who did this work, had multiple calves and stopwatches and things like that, these calves spend on average 47 minutes a day drinking, and they drink more than 10 liters a day, and they split this into about 6 to 10 meals a day, which is about the same type of behavior that we see in a beef calf nursing on a cow. So what were some of the consequences of the practices that we did, early on in terms of limit feeding this? And often what is fed is about 10% of body weight, which equates to this 4 quarts or 4 liters a day. Andrea Vieira did part of her PhD on some of these feeding behaviors, and she looked at, this was using an automatic milk feeding system, and she had 2 treatment groups. She gave calves ad libitum access, so they could go to the milk feeder whenever they want and drink as much as they wanted. And then the other one was the conventional, so 4 liters per day, and the computer was basically, I think it was 4 1-liter meals. Interesting, and this is sort of, at first, when one thinks about it quickly, totally counterintuitive. Those calves that were fed ad libitum, so could drink as much as they wanted, they only spent about 50 to 60 minutes in the feeder. Again, very similar to what they would do if they were on a cow. The calves that were limit fed were spent twice as much time, over 100, 110 minutes a day in that feeder. And for those of you that have experience with these feeding systems, a lot of the times when we implement these types of automatic milk feeders, they're not cheap. So we justify this by saying, okay, we're going to feed 20 calves off one feeder. Well, if we limit feed those calves, you can imagine that we simply run out of time in a 24-hour day. And then you hear about these disasters of cross-sucking and disease transfer, and it's a disaster. Anyways, Andrea was interested, what were these calves doing? And remember, the computer feeder was programmed to only allow these calves, to the 4-liter calves, to get their allotment. And so when she looked at the rewarded versus the unrewarded visits, you can see here, actually it was twice a day, 2 liters. You can see that basically what they were doing was gambling. I think, and when we published this paper, it was really the first time that we had very strong evidence that these calves were really, really hungry. And again, from a practical perspective, what do hungry infant mammals do? They suck. They try to suck, and they suck on anything that they can suck on. And so again, you can imagine in these types of situations, the type of cross-sucking that goes on. So we had strong evidence that these calves were hungry. And so we were then interested in saying, okay, well, what happens now if we were to give more milk and sort of try to meet the motivational demand that these calves seem to have for milk? And this was some work that was done by Mohammed Khan. This is actually just before he came to us. He spent 4 years as a postdoc. He was a ruminant nutritionist. And we were really interested in seeing, what we could do in terms of feeding calves more milk. And the reason that we actually hired him as a postdoc is he had published this, what I would say in 2007 was one of the most elegantly done studies out there. This was all on individual housing at that time, but he took the work that we had published on feeding higher volumes of milk and was really interested in looking at sort of the entire nutrition profile. So what happened in terms of starter intake. One reason when we look through the previous literature in reasons for feeding these low amounts of milk is because we know that the calf during the milk feeding period is incredibly vulnerable to disease. That's when you look at the data with calves are going to die, they're going to die during the milk feeding period. So the best thing we can do is get them off milk as fast as possible. To get them off milk, we need them to eat starter and to transition, to become a ruminant, transition to solid feed. And so the wisdom was, well, let's not feed a lot of milk because then they'll eat starter. And so Khan was really interested in a couple of things. One was what would happen to starter intake if you were feeding higher volumes of milk? And then how do we promote eating starter in these calves that are fed higher volumes of milk? And so he had two treatment groups. The red line here is the conventional. So these calves were fed 10% of body weight. So starting out at about 4 kilos of milk a day, or 4 liters of milk a day. And then the step down, or the high volume milk, they were fed twice that. So they were given 20% of body weight, so about 8 liters a day. And when we know that higher, especially in these young calves, the more milk you feed, the less likely they're going to eat starter. And so what he did is at day 24, he reduced the step down treatment over the course of a week. So basically one of the take home messages I'm going to have here is don't do anything fast with these baby calves in terms of changing their diet. So over the course of a week, he slowly reduced the amount of milk to 10% of their body weight. And then he fed them, everybody along, until day 46. And then over the course of 5 days, or 3 or 4 days, he again, actually 5 days, he weaned them down to 0 milk volume. Okay, that was the plan. This is starter intake. And remember, so starter intake grams per day, and then calf age in days. And so basically they were weaned, remember, at about day 52, and he weighed them, he took them out until 90 days, okay? And so the idea was if we feed low volumes of milk, then they should eat lots of starter. And what you can see here is before really 30 to 40 days, regardless of how much milk those calves get, even if they only get 10% of body weight, we're not seeing any appreciable starter intake. Those calves that had higher volumes of milk, as soon as it became this step down happened, and so they went down to 10% of body weight in terms of milk, you see this increase in starter intake. And this advantage in terms of starter intake pulls out all the way to the end of the trial. And you can see this is a huge difference in the amount of starter intake. One thing to remember, to think about here, is that the fact that these calves were also much heavier. So this is body weight kilograms. No difference really until about 15 days of age. And then you can see these step down calves who had the higher volumes of milk for the first 24 days really had an advantage in terms of body weight, and that they maintained that advantage to 90 days at the end of the trial. So one of the things that, and a big take home message here is that you're not going to increase starter intake in these first 3 to 4 weeks of life by feeding less milk. These calves are not physiologically able to digest starter. They're mammals, neonates. What they are very good at doing is taking milk and converting that to lean tissue growth. So we need to take advantage of that. Of course, the question now comes is how much milk? So we've been doing quite a bit of work on looking at, what is the right amount of work. And this is some work done by Katarina Rosenberger. We published this, a decade after Kahn published that first work, looking at 6, 8, 10, and 12 liters of milk. And lo and behold, you give them 12 liters of milk and they'll drink it. And again, here we employed this step down. So about halfway through the milk feeding period, we started reducing, about 4 weeks of age, we started reducing the amount of milk over the course of 3 to 5 days, and then continued on. And then weaning didn't start until day 44, I think it was here. So this is milk intake. Oops. Again, I think the interesting thing for what we feel here is 6 liters is more than 4 liters. So this is 2 liters more than what was conventional at that time. And even 8 liters is double. When we look at the number of times that, and this is done using an automatic milk feeder, so we can record how many times these calves are entering the feeder looking for milk. you can see that we still see a significant number of unrewarded visits in the calves that were only fed 6 liters a day, which basically tells me these calves are still very, very hungry. We see less hunger behavior in 8 liters, and it's not until we get to the 10 or 12 liters that we're really removing any appreciable evidence of hunger. Of course, as we wean these calves, we're seeing this increase in unrewarded visits as they're transitioning from the milk feeding to the solid feed. And we're doing lots and lots of work now in order to try to minimize the stress associated with transition. This is body weight again, and you can see that the higher the milk volume, the greater the weight gains. And it really is these 10 or 12 liters a day where these calves are fed these high volumes of milk, and they thank us by increasing weight gain. But remember, these treatment groups were only until about 4 weeks of age, at which time that there was the first step down. And that's something that we're really recommending now. Is we absolutely understand that the milk feeding period is still a vulnerable time for the calf, and it's also a challenging time for the farmer, because you still, often these calves get sick, and the quicker we can transition them off the milk feeding onto solid feed, the less likely that they're going to die. And so we have, I've had many conversations with farmers who have thought about, okay, well, these calves are little, so I won't feed so much milk when they're really little, and then I'll increase the milk volume as they get older. What we're saying now is flip that on its head. In that first 3 to 4 weeks of life, try to give as much milk as you can. And then once they're physiologically, they're starting to transition to become a ruminant, then you can start reducing that milk volume. And this will allow them to, will make them, they're going to be looking for food, to start increasing starter intake. And we know that, the more starter intake they're used to eating, then ultimately when you do the last step down, so the removal of the milk, it's an easier time for them to transition. The upside of this is that there is a growing amount of evidence that, increasing these pre-weaning weight gains, predicts future productivity. And, those calves are going to thank you later in life by simply producing more milk, which is dollars in the tank. And it's I think often hard for us to get our heads wrapped around this, because you're putting money in early on, and the payback is not tomorrow, or not the next day, or not even next week. The payback is 2 years down the road. But it's very clear now, and there's a number of different studies done that really emphasize, or really give us strong evidence that there is an increase in milk yield down the road. So in terms of this section, we need to feed calves more milk. And the other thing that, I didn't spend a lot of time on it, but really it has to be through a nipple. This feeding of buckets, I'm going to be really blunt, it has to stop. Because if we don't feed calves through a nipple, if we continue to feed through a bucket, then we can't really take advantage of all the other benefits that come with social housing. One of the things that and I know I've been on lots of farms where farmers really want to do social housing, but they actually adopt social housing before they actually change their feeding system. And almost always that's a complete disaster. So when you're working with farms, the first thing to do is, if they're individual housing, feeding through a bucket, is change to a nipple feeding system. And yes, I know it's going to take a little bit more work, and you're going to have to clean these things. But once you do all that, and feeding calves more milk via a nipple, and again, these nipples, make sure that the hole is small, don't make the hole big, because you want these calves to work for when they drink that milk. All of that will promote the calf's ability to engage in these highly motivated behaviors, which is sucking and milk drinking. And then take-home message again is, don't do anything abruptly, don't wean abruptly. This has to be done slowly, and don't go from feeding 10 liters a day today to 0 tomorrow, because I guarantee you it's going to be a disaster. So you need to slowly decrease the milk, and then you're going to see starter intake increase. when you do all those things, we've been actually looking at the whole role of forage in the young calf diet. And, again, this comes from my personal background in the beef industry. I know that when I saw these calves being born and they were with their calves, and, we would go out and feed the silage or the hay in the morning, and these calves, early on, and, 4 or 5 days of age, would start playing with the hay. And so, I kept thinking about that and thinking, what is it about, what are these calves interested in? And I think this is where, many of you may not know this, but my original training was in ruminant nutrition. And so much when it came to ruminant nutrition, when we measured things or evaluated things, it was always about how much did they eat? And the more they ate, the better. And so when it came to forage in calf diets, we know, and because people had, this had been shown in the literature, and that calves that were fed low volumes of milk, feeding them forage was a disaster, because all these calves, all they would do is eat the hay and get these hay bellies, and they weren't ready to eat the hay from a physiological perspective. And when we looked at doing some of the review of the literature and some of the very old work, believe it or not, a lot of the old work looking at different types of calf starter and what the composition would be was done on calves on slatted floors. And when we tracked down a few of the older professors, and this is 15 years ago when we did some of the reviews on this, asked them, well, why did you have the calves on slatted floors? And the answer was, well, if we had them on straw bedding or on a sawdust bedding, the calves ate the straw or ate the sawdust, and that messed up with our measurements of the starter. And I think back, and I think, maybe these calves were trying to tell us something. So anyhow, Khan, when he did join us as a postdoc, we did some work looking at feeding higher volumes of milk. So we had two groups of calves. These were calves that were just given 8 liters of milk a day. They were stepped down at 4 weeks of age and then run out to about 45 days, and then in terms of milk, and then they were weaned. Half the calves were given only starter during the milk feeding period, and the other half the calves were given starter and hay. And this is the intake in terms of dry matter intake, and you can see that those calves that had starter and hay ate more, not so much before weaning, but definitely after. They seemed to transition better and consume more dry matter intake up to 10 weeks of age. In each of the treatment groups, we had some bulls, and we then, slaughtered these bulls. And what we looked at was their rumens, and what Khan showed, so on the left here is rumen pH. So calves that just had starter, and then calves that had starter plus forage. And you can see that the rumen pH was higher in these calves at 10 weeks that had starter plus forage through the entire feeding period. And so these calves are slaughtered 10 weeks. So they had been weaned for a number of weeks. And so I think what's happening here is that this having access to forage seems to help mitigate rumen acidosis, I think, to some degree, and they're just better able to get these rumens working the way they should be working. When we looked at the rumen weight, so in terms of the rumen apparatus, we also had a significant increase in the development of the rumen in terms of weight in those calves that had forage compared to those that didn't. So the take-home message for us here is that I don't think we should get hung up on the amount of forage that they eat. If they're getting fed lots of milk, my feeling is they're not using the forage for nutrient intake. This is about having the right nutrients there from the scratch factor to help them transition to be from a monogastric to a full functioning ruminant. So calves want to become ruminants, and we believe that forage likely plays a role in facilitating this transition. And so we, at least in our research farm now, because we're feeding higher volumes of milk, they don't need the forage for nutrition. All the calves get forage right from the get-go. So I want to transition now to housing. Historically, we've individually housed, and we did it likely for good reasons at that time. It's because calves, the way we were managing them, they were cross-sucking. These calves, they drink, they'd get their 2 liters of milk in the bucket, and they would drink that up as fast as possible. And then they would suck on whatever else is there, the chain, the bucket, and God forbid if there was another calf, they would suck on that calf. And, you can just imagine the disease transmission. So we were interested in, once we got the feeding sorted out, what we could were there other benefits to social housing? And again, we're thinking about this from the perspective that these calves, or cattle in general, are herd animals. They're social beings. Are there things that that these calves are missing out on by being socially isolated for the first 4, 6, 8 weeks of life? So Andrea did a study where she looked at individual and pair housing. In this case, the management from a feeding perspective was identical. They all had access to forage, they had access to starter, they had access to water, they were fed milk via nipple bottles, and they were fed 8 liters a day, 4 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon and she did this during the summer. So having milk available at noon when it was whatever, 80 degrees out or 30 degrees Celsius was not a good idea. And we've done lots of work on that. That seems to work quite well. They adjust their feeding behavior patterns they just know that, I've got my milk in the morning and my milk in the afternoon. So everything was the same, except you can see here, we have these individual pens. And then on the right, you can see this plasticized wall. We can simply take that wall out. And so now we have everything the same, except that in the treatment group, these 2 calves per calf had the same amount of space, but these 2 calves could share those 2 spaces. So one of the things she did is she looked at weaning distress, and these calves it was all in the same barn. So we had an individual pair, individual pair, individual pair. And then on the flip side, we had the same thing again. So individual calves they couldn't see the calves beside them, but they could see the calves across whatever it was, 6 feet across the alley. And so she then stepped down again. At the end, she did a step down at about 30 days. And then about 42 days, she started weaning them, stopping the milk completely over the course of 4 or 5 days. And then what she did is she actually looked at vocalizations. And so this is the number of calls per 2-hour period. And she always weaned, made sure that she had a single calf and a pair house calves because this is a dynamic, like not all calves were on treatment at the same time. She enrolled them as they were born, but she always made sure that when she weaned, took the milk away, that she always had a representation from each treatment group. And what you can see here is that those single house calves, despite the fact that they could see other calves, were calling and vocalizing, almost 2.5 times as much as those pair house calves. And I often say here, I think this is, if you're going to go through a stressful event, it's better to go through a stressful event with a friend than by yourself. She then she kept these calves in their individual pens. And I mean, the other thing that she also showed, just to be clear here, is that these calves that were pair housed also consumed much more starter during the milk feeding period. So it's significant increase in starter intake. And again, what we think here is social facilitation, that those calves that had a friend, one calf would go eat starter, the other one would see this and then would follow that calf. So we had this increase in starter intake and a significant reduction in weaning distress. She kept the calves there in those pens until a week after. So they were all consuming lots of grain out of their buckets and had sort of, as far as we could tell, sort of come through that stressful weaning period. She then moved an individual calf and two pair housed calves into the group feeding pen. And this is the group feeding pen from the calf's perspective in our research facility. There's there's the race on the right is actually access to forage. They've got water intake, and they have a grain feeder. This is, for those of you who are interested, this is actually pig tenderfoot footing, flooring that we put in our barn, and there's an underground scraper underneath, but it allows us to keep the pens a little bit cleaner, and it's been super successful for us. And then they have this open bedded pack. In the pen were 3 calves that already knew how to use the starter feeder. Because remember, prior to this, they were eating starter out of a bucket. So this was something new for them to go into a race to eat starter. And so Andrea brought these calves in, these 3 calves at a time, into this pen. One was an individual and the one pair. And then she looked at their feeding behavior. One of the things that she looked at was the latency to start using the starter feeder. And this is the time after regrouping or mixing into this pen. And this is hours. The pair house calves took on average 9 hours before they had their first grain meal. And the individual calves took almost 50 hours. So more than 2 days before they had their first starter intake. This is solid feed intake for the days after being moved into the group house pen. And you can see that those calves that were individual, which is the red line, there was no, I mean, they didn't eat for 2 days. And then they ate a lot, and then they backed off. And then they ate a lot, and then they backed off. And you can see that, you know, they're still not as stable and not eating as much as those pair house calves. And this trial ended 14 days after mixing. The pair house calves, I mean, it took them about 9 hours, but they never really missed a beat. What's also very interesting here is look at the weight gain. Not surprising if you don't eat for 2 days. They lost 2.5 kilos of weight, and then they increased the weight because I think, as you can remember, once they did start eating, they ate a ton, then they backed off, then they lost weight, increased weight, lost weight, increased weight, lost weight. And we're still seeing, this is for those of you that have experience with fat cattle, this is what we call yo-yoing. And what we think is happening here is an overload of grain. They're so hungry, they're eating so much grain that they're probably suffering from acidosis. And for a ruminant, the best thing to do if you're suffering from acidosis and you have a tummy ache is not eat. And so then they got hungry again, and then they ate again, too much again, and you get this yo-yoing in terms of weight gains. Whereas those calves that had been pair housed, and remember, the only difference between these treatment groups is that the pair housing through the milk feeding period versus being by yourself, they never really missed a beat. Very stable weight gains. To understand this, Andrea, we did a follow-up study where we did an open field test. And this is, these are 2 calves. The black calf is a pair housed calf. The more white calf is an individual house calf. They have never met. And what we see here is this white calf is incredibly, I mean, I would say a lot of this is fear responses. We saw longer latencies to actually engage in touching that other calf. And then once it touched the calf, it wouldn't leave that black calf alone. It was like it didn't have any social skills in how to deal with these calves. And I think this is one thing that Andrea said when she did watch those calves being put into the group pen. Those individual calves were like rubber balls, you know, hitting the side. They were just so focused on the other calves and all this, they couldn't be calm enough to actually watch what those other calves were doing. You compare that to, these are 2 pair house calves who have never met. And I can tell you it's a very boring video. These calves, they basically were very much faster to physically touch each other. And then what they did is they explored the environment. And they just sort of looked, and I often say, you know, if calves could talk, and if we were to have given each of these calves a test on, you know, describe the environment that you were just in after this open field test, the individual calves, I don't think could have told us anything. They could have told us what that other calf looked like, but they couldn't have told us anything about the environment because they were so fearful. We've been doing work with on farm, looking at ways of trying to figure out how to do social housing in a more of a low cost method. And so this was an on-farm trial that we did, one of the farms in the Fraser Valley, where we just put 2 hutches together and then allowed the calves to just go back and forth. One mistake that I have seen, I was in, I think it was in Idaho or somewhere, where somebody was really keen on the benefits of pair housing, but then decided to put 2 calves in 1 hutch. And you can imagine then what the big issue then you have is cleanliness. And so, we would never recommend 1 hutch, 2 calves, unless that hutch, of course, is appropriately sized for these 2 calves. We do know that the calves tend to sleep together. They spend time, increase play behavior. And Laura also looked at starter intake, and we see the blue is the individually housed calves, and the gray are the pair housed calves. And you can see, that these calves, again, we see this social facilitation. These pair housed calves consume more starter. We've also done work looking at food neophobia. So giving the calves, and Laura did this as well with this on-farm experiment, where we just put a bucket of forage that they'd never seen before. We see much shorter latencies to approach this scary bucket by pair house calves, and much quicker to engage in exploring the new food source. The individual calves are so freaked that it takes them forever to even approach the bucket. So that transitions me into some of the work that we've been doing in terms of cognition and looking at the effect of how we rear these animals on cognitive ability. And so here, this was work based on Harry Harlow that had done some groundbreaking work. You would never, ever get ethics approval for this work now, but taking non-human primates, and in this case, he took these baby monkeys, and half of them he individually reared, took them away from the mother, gave them this puppet as a mother, fed them, did the things, looked after their biological needs. And then he compared them to young monkeys that had been reared in a troop with mothers and other siblings. And he looked at cognitive rigidity and food neophobia. Of course, those non-human primates that were individually housed, we had high levels of food neophobia, were incredibly fearful. And he argued in the paper that really that they had reduced behavioral flexibility. So we decided, are we doing the same thing with these individually housed calves? And so we've done a series of studies. Becky Mahar and Charlotte Gallard, we both published 2 different studies on this, and I'm just going to show you now Becky Mahar's work, where we looked at training calves to play a game, and half the calves were individually housed and half the calves were reared in a social group, and taught them how to play a game. And in this game, and I'm going to show you a video in a second, half the calves, they were brought into this pen where the game was. They had to learn how to touch a start box, which was their signal to us that they were willing to play the game. And then a computer screen at the back of the pen would turn on. Half the calves were taught that if the computer screen turns red, they were to go run back to the computer screen, touch it with their nose, and then they would get a milk reward. If the computer screen was white, they were not supposed to go. And if they did go, they got a timeout and had to wait a minute for the game to restart. And I can tell you that the calves hated the timeouts. So this is just the calf. You notice he's touched the start box. In this case, red was positive, and they get a small amount of milk, drinks the milk, and then white is a no-go task. They're pretty smart, everybody. So, and then of course, half the calves white was positive, the other half was negative. And so all the calves, regardless of whether or not you were reared individually or in a social group, could learn how to play this game, okay? That had no bearing on your ability to learn the game. So this is the learning curve. so the correct no-go responses. So in this case, you know, how often when it was white for this previous calf and they didn't go. And so you can see, and we had trainings, 2 training sessions a day, morning and afternoon. So 1 and 2 would be day 1, 3 and 4, day 2, 5 and 6, day 3, and so on. And what you can see here is that these calves, regardless of how they lived, they learned how to play the game. But then we changed the rules. If red had been positive, now white was positive. And this is what happened, is the socially housed calves took a day and a half and then they go, wow, oh, you want me to do the opposite? And they learned how to do that. The individually housed calves, very few were only about 20% got it right. And the students felt so sorry for these calves. They actually, the experiment stopped after the 14th training sessions. They took the individual house calves out for another week and they could not increase the number of the correct no-go responses. We've done other work now looking at individual for the entire milk feeding period, individual for the pair for 6 weeks, and then 2 weeks before weaning, they were paired, pair housing through the entire time, and then this full contact group. And what you can see here is that, I mean, I know part of you are thinking keeping cows together. Oh my goodness. Anyways, this is the reversal learning. Individual, again, was unable to learn the new rules. There was an advantage. They weren't as good, but even pairing 2 weeks before weaning brings an advantage. And if early pairing was just as good as being with the mother. So individual housing impairs cognition, makes calves fearful, and increases weaning distress. Social housing in pairs or small groups provides multiple advantages. So I just want to end, I've just got a few slides now to end this talk, which is, you know, what are the big issues coming? And I really, I think as a dairy industry, we can't be complacent. Calf care is a hot topic for the public. You know, these are how we care for the babies. This is just an example of a billboard in Australia that you see, you know, pushed by the vegan movement, killed for his mother's milk. They talk about cow-calf separation. And I mean, Australia is really challenged because they rely on the slaughtering of these calves within 2 to 3 weeks of life to deal with these extra calves because there is no market for them right now. You know, it's also very much becoming an issue in the United States. This is another billboard from another animal rights organization, you know, who love your mama, so does he. So we're seeing this pressure coming on how we care for these calves generally. This is also, you know, it's a challenge too, because this is, I'm sure you guys, many of you seen this, you know, the marketing agents that market milk. You know, you see these pictures of mother with calf on pasture, you know, and they're using images that they know resonate with their core values. And so we've got these challenges facing, and, you know, what are we going to do about it? One of the things that we've been interested is trying to understand public perceptions to cow-calf separation and the age of slaughter. And so this is a survey, we haven't published this, that we've just done, where we did a representative sample of Canadian Americans, and we told them, this was an online survey, we said to produce milk, cows must give birth to a calf approximately once a year. Most female calves born on dairy farms will stay on farm to produce milk once they're old enough. However, male calves cannot produce milk, and not all female calves are needed for milk. To manage this, male calves and excess female calves are commonly used for meat production. We then did what we call a 2x2. We had these 4 treatment groups that were similar in cognitive load, but we said we varied age at slaughter, so less than 2 weeks and greater than 12 months. I know in Australia, in New Zealand, it's very common to kill these bobby calves at 2 weeks. In North America, we are not, you know, we don't slaughter them per se, but we know that there's a tremendous number of calves that are euthanized on farm. Especially in the Jersey industry, because we don't know what to do with it. They're worthless. So I didn't want to talk about killing cows on farm. So we just said 2 weeks, they were separated either at 2 weeks or greater than, they were either separated early at birth or not, and they were killed at less than 2 weeks or greater than 12 months, okay? And in each case, we said You know, you can see the red and the purple is what changed, okay? We then had a bunch of questions where we looked at whether or not there was an agreement, we asked participants using a 7-point Likert scale, do they agree with this scenario? People only got one scenario. Did they find it appropriate? Did they find it acceptable? Using a bunch of stuff that I'm not going to get into, we created a construct in terms of attitude. And so what we call theta, the higher the theta value, the more positive the participant's attitude. So this is what we found. So age at slaughter, greater than 12 months or less than 2 weeks. And what you can see is groups that got scenarios where the calf was older were viewed more positive than when they were killed at younger ages. And in each case, we got a bump if they were not separated. So this is something, I think this is a huge issue that's coming. The dairy industry has to be prepared for it, because people, if they hear about this, they don't like it. These animals are living beings. How could you be so heartless to separate calves from their mother just after being born? It really hurts me to know about this. I get it that excess calves are difficult to manage. I don't mind if it's used for meat that much, but at least give them some time with their mother. It seems inappropriate to take a calf from its mother so soon. I'm not against eating meat, but they should allow the calves more time with their mothers. And I think it's slightly horrific to kill something after 2 weeks of age. I am disappointed that it is upsetting that male calves and excess female calves are slaughtered within the first couple of weeks of life. I'm sure there must be some kind of other option. So I think there's this expectation of duty of care. We also asked them about when calves should be slaughtered. And I find this super positive. Only 16% said they should never be slaughtered. The majority of them want them to have some sort of reasonable life. So we have this great divide. You know, this is the image people have of calves with their mother on pasture, and this is what we often do. We know that differences are happening in the world. In Great Britain, they've just announced on their public facing that they are now implementing a strategy where they, by 2023, are going to eliminate any euthanasia of calves, healthy calves on farms. It's a big change. In Australia, they've actually gone a step further. They've said the Australian dairy industry supports the development of more profitable and sustainable pathways for surplus calves, improving the value of surplus calves, and therefore reducing the number of calves processed or euthanized at a young age is a priority. And then they go on to say dairy farmers have been encouraged to remove calves from cows for a few major reasons. And then they list things, you know, like harvesting the milk and calf health, cow health. This is an area of renewed research as the welfare of both the cow and calf in these systems has been questioned. And then there's now, and I'm an author on both of these review papers where we've done systematic reviews of the literature. And I can't give you the science that justifies, you know, separation. This is an area requiring investigation into the practicalities and impact on animal health and welfare. So lastly, you know, I've already gone through the first three, but failure by the dairy industry to provide assurances that the surplus dairy calf has a reasonable length of life and the life has to have purpose. You saw in a number of those quotes that people actually see these calves entering the beef supply. What they don't want is to hear about a life that is indispensable, that it is just this byproduct that is worthless. And I'm going to tell you that as cow-calf separation awareness grows, that it is going to become a bigger topic, and the industry has to engage. Otherwise, decisions are going to be made in the absence of the farmer. On that note, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So the first question that has came through so far, and I would like to remind everyone, if you have any questions, for Nina to please type them into the Q&A. But the first one that we have here is, what do you think about ab libitum milk during the first 30 days?
I'm a huge fan of it. You know, I mean, I think what we need to do is we have to learn from what happens with the mother. You know, I mean, I'm a huge fan of it. We do a lot of it. I absolutely recognize that economics comes into play. So if push comes to shove, you know, I don't think 8 liters is enough anymore. I think we should be feeding 10 or 12. And again, you know, we only need to do this for the first 30 days, and then you can slowly bring that down. So yeah, that's my answer to that.
Okay, thank you. At this time, we don't have any other questions, so I'll give it just a minute or two to see if anyone else comes in with questions. But during this time, I would just like to remind everyone that on August 6th, we have our next VES-Artex Academy webinar, which is Reaching Across the Culture Border. And on August 20th, we have a webinar on the evolution of the fresh air injection strategy in modern dairy facilities. So another question did come through though. Is dry TMR for calves also an alternative?
Dry TMR. So sorry, I forgot to show this, but anyways. So we've just been doing some work now, and I mean, I didn't show it because we're not quite finished yet. We're going to have some data looking at TMR versus hay and whether or not there's advantages or disadvantages of one over the other. I mean, the preliminary data shows that and this is, in this case, we used the TMR that came from the cow barn. So it had some grain, you know, from there, and they do like the TMR, but I think the preliminary data shows that there may be an advantage in weight gain at about 90 days with those calves that are fed hay. But just give me a minute, and we're going to try. We'll be submitting that paper in the next 2 months or so, and we'll have better data on there. I saw one of the questions was about acidified milk versus, what are the practical ways of implementing ad libitum feeding? Is it possible without a robotic feeder? Yeah, I think the answer to we have early on in a very, $5 system. We had, and again, you know, climate is going to matter, but at least in the wintertime, we would just put a bucket of milk with a one-way valve to stop sort of the backwash of the milk, and just filled this bucket, and that worked reasonably well. I know that what I've been looking at, or we did, is we actually bought a bunch of milk feeding apparatus, these buckets with milk nipple bottles on them. We bought them from the veal industry because they're used to feeding higher volumes of milk, because that was one of the problems. And so we have these big containers that hold 5 or 6 liters of milk. And those calves, if they know the milk's only there for 2 hours in the morning, they get it done. Okay. They figure that out pretty quickly. Annie, do you want me to answer? I just pulled up the Q&A. Do you want me to answer these questions, or are you going to tell me which ones to answer?
Whatever is easier for you. I can definitely ask, or
yeah. Well, I'll answer the one that, are there any systems that cows and calves aren't separated in confinement? So this is the hottest topic in Europe right now. So I've done 2 or 3 webinars on cow-calf contact systems in Europe. There is a Facebook page in Scandinavia with over 1,000 farmers on it asking questions about cow-calf contact. So we know that in Germany, there's like 250 farms already doing this. The Netherlands, there's an excess of, I'm sure there's 200 of them now. France has got farms like this. And the challenge that these farmers have is that there's no science to help guide practice, but there's a ton of pressure to do this. And so this is one of the things that I've been really promoting, is that I think the dairy industries and scientists, we need to figure out how to engage in research in cow-calf contact systems, because for the average farmer, there is so much risk that this could go wrong. Wrong for the cow, wrong for the calf, wrong financially, wrong, like I say, 1,000 reasons. And so this is where science can help. And of course, you know, I benefit from that as a science, and I totally recognize that. But we can do science in this as a researcher. I will get paid next week. And what science can help us is figure out what's not going to work as we try to strive for what is working. I know that, is this something that is going to rear its head in the 10 years? I don't think so. I think it's going to be faster than that. I think there's going to be huge pressure to look at what cow-calf contact systems are. And I know that the majority, like the Europeans, I've had a number of scientists email me asking for ideas on how to do this, because in their jurisdictions, the only work that they feel that they're going to get a chance to be funded is looking at cow-calf contact. Somebody said, what about additional fresh water, either in a pail or with a hog nipple drinker? You guys, calves, regardless of how much you're feeding them, milk, have to have access to fresh water. That is a key welfare issue. And so they should have a separate bucket with water. I don't see any benefit to these hog drinkers or whatever. They drink milk out of a nipple and they get access to a bucket. And practically speaking, it's one less thing, you know, I think it's easier to clean a bucket than it is to clean another nipple that has been used to facilitate water. You know, we've done work on farms here, especially, I mean, we just went through in the Pacific Northwest, this heat stress, you know, even though it's mandatory now by the Dairy Farmers of Canada that all calves should have access to water, but we know, I mean, I think people think that they're getting enough fluid through the milk. We've had cases years ago, we were looking at taking blood samples on calves. We couldn't even find a vein in some of those calves in the hutches in the hot weather. Corbin asks, what is the maximum number of calves you would like to see in a group? So it's a great question, and I should have talked about this earlier. The evidence, and we've reviewed the literature on this, looking at the epidemiological work. To me, if the maximum would be sort of eight calves, 8 to 10 calves max. Of course, this makes the economics on a automatic calf feeder not look so great. But we know that that from the feeding behavior that allows these calves access to the drinker when they need it. It also minimizes the risk of, if disease does happen, that there's a massive outbreak. You know, I'm a huge fan, as you can tell, of the pair housing. I think it's the easiest, you know, part of this is training caregivers, calf caregivers on a new system. So if they've been managing calves individually, to go from individual to a group of 20, I'm sure I can hear your thoughts saying that it's going to be a disaster. Of course, it's going to be a disaster. So we often say to farmers that are thinking about transitioning is to first, as I said, get the milk feeding right, you know, nipple, higher volumes of milk, make sure that they're not hungry, and then do your own little study, individual pair. And the thing that's super interesting, what comes back the quickest from the people doing this is at how calm the pair house calves are. And they don't, you know, I don't know if you've ever been on a calf ranch and you're walking along and these calves are out of their little hutch in their wire cage there, and all of a sudden they see you and then they run back and they hit the back of the pen. We don't see that behavior in socially housed calves.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. von Keyserlingk. I think we will end it there since I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much, everyone, for spending your afternoon or your morning, depending where you are, with us. And we hope to see you at some of our upcoming webinars. Thanks and have a great day.
Yeah, if anybody wants any more questions, don't hesitate to contact me.